Hey, Professor Carl, and welcome back to Beneath the Narrative. I am Sherry.
And I'm Carl. Today we're tackling a really complex moment of global history, the Spanish arrival and colonization of the Philippines, starting around 1565.
When we hear the word Age of Conquest, we often think of the Americas. Heroic conquistadors, culture clashes, or catastrophic collapse, like Stephen Stern outlined in Session 5. But the Philippines offers a different, slower-moving case of rupture.
Exactly. As William Henry Scott showed using Spanish sources, Legazpi's expedition arrived in an archipelago of small-scale barangay societies, each with its own structure and culture. There was no centralized empire to overthrow, so conquest looked different.
And the Spanish approach itself was multifaceted. Military force was just part of it, as we saw with Pitafata's account of Magellan's violence first contact, mentioned in Session 10. But lasting control relied more on systems, political restructuring, economic imposition, and especially Catholic evangelization. Phelan's work describes this as Hispanization, a slow but deep transformation.
And religion wasn't just one element. It was a method of conquest. Vicente Rafael argues that conversion was shaped by mistranslation and negotiation, not just imposition. Christian terms took on Tagalog meanings, and this reshaped identity and society from the inside.
At the same time, colonization brought devastating biological consequences. Linda Newson's Conquest and Patterson's challenges earlier assumptions of immunity from Asian trade exposure. She argues that disease, arriving after 1565, caused significant and uneven population decline.
So we're looking at a convergence of ruptures: military, political, religious, economic, and epidemiological. New systems like tribute, forced labor, and reducción were layered atop a society already being reshaped and sickened.
That raises key questions. Which of these forces caused the most profound rupture? How did they interact? And how do we assess Filipino experiences when most of our sources are Spanish? And, as Makarov-Troffin reminds us, archives themselves can produce historical silences.
And that brings us to the heart of our investigation. Phelan emphasizes socio-political change. Raphael focuses on cultural, linguistic shifts. Newson on biological collapse, and Scott on what was lost. Our guiding question is:
considering the multifaceted nature of the Spanish instruction into Philippines between 1565 and 1700, how should we comparatively weigh the significance of military conquest, religious conversion, colonial economic demands, and epidemic disease in causing these most profound ruptures and transformations within diverse Filipino societies? Furthermore, how do the inherent biases within the predominantly Spanish sources challenge or even enable our efforts to reconstruct Filipino agency and varied responses during this critical age of conquest?
To explore this, we'll analyze two key missionary texts and bring four historians into conversation, hoping, as always, to avoid the easy answers. So, Sherry, that's our big question. Weighing conquest, conversion, economy, and disease in reshaping the early Spanish Philippines, it's a complex picture, and historians definitely don't all paint it the same way.
Absolutely. And wading through the debates, looking at the evidence, especially through the often biased Spanish lens Triggered warns us about, we've arrived at our own interpretation, our historical argument for this podcast.
Right. So here's our thesis. While the initial Spanish military conquest and epidemic disease created initial rupture in the Philippines, it was religious conversion and colonial institutional restructuring that most deeply transformed Filipino society between 1565 and 1700, reshaping worldviews, communities, and hierarchies in ways that remain visible even through biased colonial sources.
That's a mouthful, Carl, but it gets to the core of it. Let's break it down a bit. We were definitely not dismissing the initial violence or epidemics. Newson's work, Conquest and Pestilence, is absolutely vital here. She documents the likely introduction or intensified spread of diseases like smallpox or measles after 1565, and argues persuasively against the older idea of widespread pre-colonial immunity. She documents the likely introduction or intensified spread of diseases like smallpox and measles after 1565, and argues persuasively against the older idea of widespread pre-colonial immunity. The demographic collapse in many areas, which she details regionally, was triggering and certainly a massive rupture, fitting Stern's conquest as disease paradigm.
For sure, and the military phase, the actual conquista, was a necessary precondition. It established a Spanish presence, however tenuous initially, and created the political space for everything that followed. Early accounts like those surrounding Legazpi's expeditions, or even Pigafetta's descriptions from Magellan's time, detail the violence, the demands for tribute, and the sacking of villages that Newson also points out to as contributing factors to population decline in the first decades. It was brutal, and it established the power imbalance.
That's absolutely right. And our argument is that while conquest initiated disruption and disease caused massive population loss, neither transformed core structures of belief, community, or identity as deeply or enduringly as the combined forces of religious conversion and the new colonial order did over time.
Exactly. Take conversion. Phelan's Hispanization of the Philippines maps out the introduction of the Catholic doctrine and ritual. But it's more than just adding a new religion. Vicente Rafael, in Contracting Colonialism, takes this further, exploring how the very act of translation, required by missionaries, reshaped Tagalog language and thought. Concepts like God, Dios, soul, kaluluwa, in some contexts but distinct from the Spanish alma, sin, kasalanan, derived from sala or error, and death needed translation. And this process, as Raphael shows, was a site of intense negotiation and misunderstanding. It wasn't just acceptance, it was an active, often ambivalent, contracting with colonial power through language itself.
Right. This process deeply reshaped how people understood the world. As Scott showed in Berenguer, pre-colonial beliefs such as devotion to ancestor spirits, what they call in Anito in Philippine, and community rituals, were often suppressed, pushed underground, or blended into Catholic. As Scott shows in Berenguer, pre-colonial beliefs such as devotion to ancestor spirits and community rituals were often suppressed, pushed underground, or blended into Catholic practices. The result was a transformed religious landscape and a new sense of the cosmos itself, one that reached far deeper into daily life than the initial shock of military conquest.
And this religious transformation went hand in hand with the imposition of new political and economic structures. Phelan details the establishment of the encomienda system. Though maybe less central economically than in the Americas, as Stern suggests, the demands for tribute in goods and cash and forced labor drafts, the polo y servicios. Newson also emphasizes how these demands, especially during the Hispano-Dutch War in the 17th century, severely disrupted subsistence activities, forced migration, and led to population decline.
These weren't just economic burdens, they also restructured society. The Spanish reliance on local elites, the principia, often formal datos, to collect tribute and organize labor, created new internal hierarchies and power dynamics within Filipino societies. as Finland outlines. The resettled policy, the reductio, aimed to bring dispersed barony populations under the belts into newly established towns centered around the church plaza. This physically reorganized communities, altering land use, kinship patterns, and political authority.
So, while disease caused massive death tolls and conquest established dominance, it was this slower, more grinding process of cultural and structural transformation through religion and colonial administration that, we argue, had the most profound and lasting impact on reshaping Filipino societies, from the diverse, localized barangays Scott describes, into the Catholic, Hispanized, and internally stratified colony documented by the end of the 17th century.
Right, and crucially, we believe we can see evidence of both this transformation and Filipino negotiation and resistance within it, precisely by carefully analyzing the primary sources: millenary account, administrative reports, early grammas, despite their biases. Reading them critically, as Churio argues, allows us to glimpse the complex Filipino responses that Phelan notes, the linguistic approximation Raphael highlights, and the resilience of local structures as Scott reconstructs. It's a story not just of imposition, but of complex, often corralled, adaptation and change.
That's the argument we're laying out. The intertwined forces of Catholic conversion and colonial restructuring were the primary engines driving the fundamental reshaping of Filipino societies in this early period, with conquest and disease acting as crucial, devastating catalysts and preconditions.
Let's bring our first primary source. To really understand the rupture caused by Spanish colonization, we need to grasp what society looked like before, or at least how the Spanish saw it. A key text here is Wanda Plasencia's Customs of the Tagalogs, written in 1589.
Right. Plasencia was a Franciscan missionary, and his account was basically an ethnographic report for the colonial government. Its purpose wasn't neutral observation. It was explicitly intended to help the administration understand, and therefore, better control and convert the Tagalogs. This immediately flags it as a source deeply embedded in the colonial project, shaped by what Session 7 called ethnocentrism and the specific #context of early evangelization.
Definitely. When you read Plasencia, it's clear that he's trying to map Tagalog society onto familiar European categories. He outlines the three main estates. The Tadus or shifts, the Mahalikas or knobs, through he admits they are not quite like. Okay, I'll start over the whole paragraph again. Definitely, when you read Plasencia, it's clear that he's trying to map Tagalog society onto familiar European categories. He outlines three main estates: the Tadus or chiefs, the Mahalikas or knobs, though he admits that they are not quite like European aristocracy, and the Athens or slaves. But even as he applies these labels, the complexity of Tagalog social relations keeps bumbling up, challenging his framework.
Take the Alipin. Plasencia struggles to equate them directly with European chattel slaves. He has to distinguish between Aliping namamahay, or those with their own houses and property, owing specific labor or harvest shares, and Aliping sa guiguilir, the hearth slaves, more dependent, living in the master's house. This distinction itself reveals a system based less on fixed legal status and more on varying degrees of obligation and dependency, likely rooted in debt, kinship, or capture. something quite different from European feudalism or later plantation slavery. It hints at the fluid social mobility that Scott emphasizes in Barangay.
Plasencia's account also reviews how decentralized power was in pre-colonial society. The Datu led his barangay, a kinship-based community, often named after a boat, as Scott notes. But his authority came after lineage, influence, or success in trade or warfare, not absolute rule. Disputes were usually resolved through intermediaries or customary law, not by the Datu alone. This stands in the stark contrast to the centralized hierarchical political and religious systems that Spanish sought to establish, as described in Filipin's Hispanization.
And this account of Tagalog religion is fascinating and deeply revealing of the missionary lens. He describes beliefs in spirits like the Anito, ancestor worship, and various ritual practices, but frames them explicitly as superstitions and works of the devil. He notes the absence of temples or a formal priesthood comparable to Catholicism. For Plasencia, this lack of recognizable religious infrastructure wasn't a sign of a different kind of spirituality, but evidence of a religious vacuum waiting to be filled by the quote-unquote true faith. His purpose is clear: identify the errors of paganism to better eradicate them through conversion.
That's right. Reading Plasencia critically then allows us to do a couple of things essential to our argument. So first of all, evidence-based. We can extract details about the 16th century Tagalog social structure, economic practices like the communal land use alongside forms of private obligation, and religious beliefs. And it really provides a baseline against which to measure the transformations brought by Spain. We see a society organized around kinship, reciprocal obligations, perhaps early forms of agana loop that Raphael discussed in later contexts, and also localized authority.
Exactly. Second, applying critique here, we see how the Spanish colonization project operated through knowledge production. Plasencia's text here isn't just a description, it's an act of reducing, to use the term reducir from Spain, Tagalog reality into categories manageable for colonial administration and ripe for Christian intervention. It categorizes people to dato, maharlika, alipin, practices, as in superstitions, and beliefs in a way that justifies the civilizing mission. It creates a framework where conversion appears not just desirable, but necessary.
I absolutely agree with you, Carl. And I think, last but not least, it really shows us the historical silences Trejo talks about. What perspectives are missing, right? The voices of the elephant, the perspectives of women, and the nuances of, the non-Christian belief systems seen from the inside. These are largely absent or filtered through Plasencia's missionary framework, because we need to be aware that his goal is conversion and control, not relativistic understanding, as what we learned in session 7.
You're making me think. So we can say that Plasencia's customs is invaluable, and not as an objective window onto the past, but as a primary source revealing the mentality of the colonizer and the specific ways they sought to understand and categorize Filipino society as a prelude to transforming it through the intertwined processes of religious conversion and colonial administration. This is the very forces our podcast argues were most fundamentally disruptive. It perfectly illustrates the initial phase of the cultural encounter, setting the stage for deeper Hispanization, as Phelan describes, and complex negotiations that Raphael analyzes. Alright, Sherry. After looking at how Plasencia categorized Tagalog society for the Spanish administration, let's bring in another crucial voice from that early colonial period, the Jesuit missionary Pedro Chirino. His Relación de la Isla Filipinas, published in 1604, gives us a narrative perspective on the ground, focusing on the process of evangelization.
That's right. And I think Chilino's account is super valuable here because he describes the interactions, how missionaries engage with Filipinos, the methods they used, and the responses they perceived. But like Placencia, we have to approach him with critical awareness. He's writing from a Jesuit perspective, aiming to document and likely glorify the mission's progress, because he tried to justify their methods and perhaps secure further support from Spain and Rome. His context is that of an active agent of conversion.
Sharp observation there. I think his account strongly supports our argument even. About the profound impact of religious conversion and new colonial structures. He doesn't just talk about political submission. He actually describes the effort to reshape the very fabric of Filipino life. For example, he details the establishment of schools alongside churches, teaching not just catechism, but also Spanish literacy and customs, aiming to create a new kind of civilized subject, as Phelan termed it.
100%. And I think Chilino provides vivid descriptions of the conversion process itself. I don't know if you noticed it when you were reading his book. He talks about the initial resistance or indifference he encountered, but also moments of apparent enthusiasm, especially during the baptisms and the festas. He notes, for instance, how Filipinos were drawn to the solemnity and spectacle of Catholic rituals, which sounds exciting, right? And this focus on ritual and performance rather than just abstract doctrine may offer a clue to Filipino reception for us. Maybe they engage with the practice of Christianity in ways that didn't always align perfectly with Spanish theological intentions. This hints at the kind of contradicting that Raffles discusses.
Evidence-based right there. He also gives us glimpses of the local dynamic in action. Chirino describes how Jesuit learned Tagalog and other local languages to preach, compose catechisms, and pray in vernacular. He also notes, though, the introduction of Spanish words and concepts, especially religious ones, that didn't have direct equivalents. This linguistic exchange, this forced translation, and also introduced untranslatable terms. Terms like Dios, Espiritu Santo, Iglesia. It fundamentally altered the Tagalog and Cebuano, I know it because I've lived it, linguistic landscape, just as Raphael argues.
100%. And Chilino's work unintentionally reviews Filipino agency, even as he tries to frame everything with being a narrative of successful evangelization. He describes instances of syncretism, where the Filipinos blending pre-colonial beliefs with the Catholicism, sometimes invoking anecdotes alongside with saints, which is kind of funny. While Chilino often condemns this as imperfect conversion or even backsliding, from a historical perspective, informed by Scott's work on the resilience of American culture, we can see it as Filipinos actively negotiating with a new religion, adapting it to their existing worldview rather than just being passive recipients.
He also touches upon the impact of colonial structures beyond direct evangelization. He mentions the reducción policy, or the resettlement of Filipinos into larger villages, noting its difficulty but also its necessity from the Spanish perspective for administration and conversion. This directly connects to the reshaping of communities and the disruption of traditional subsistence patterns that Newsom links to population decline. Though Chirino doesn't focus on disease to the extent Newton does, his descriptions of community lives provide contextual background for understanding how maybe resettlement facilitated epidemic spread after all.
That's interesting. So, critiquing Chilino means recognizing his missionary agenda and also the Eurocentric lens. He views Filipino actions primarily in terms of whether they signal conversion success or failure, As a result, he may overstate enthusiasm or minimize resistance that doesn't really align with his narrative, contributing to potential #historical silences. What we don't get is an unfiltered Filipino voice here.
Nice catch. Though I must say, but despite these limitations, Chirino's Relación provides powerful evidence-based support for our thesis. It vividly documents the mechanisms of cultural change via preaching, translation, ritual, education, and resettlement. And these are driven by the intertwined goals of religious conversion and colonial control. It actually shows the Spanish working to restructure not just political authority, but also language, belief, community organization, and daily life.
Love this. And I think if we compare it to Plasencia's more static structural account, Chileno really gives us a narrative of the process of transformation. And by reading his observations on Filipino responses carefully, their engagement with ritual, their linguistic adaptations, their moments of resistance or syncretism, we see evidence for the complex negotiation, rather than simple imposition, that really categorize this profound historical rupture.
Okay, Sherry. We've looked at some primary sources, like Plasencia categorizing and Chirino narrating the mission. Now, let's finally dig into how historians have interpreted this whole era. We have to start with John Letty Phelan's The Hispanization of the Philippines, right? It's kind of the classic work from the mid-20th century that sets the terms for a lot of the later debate.
Right, and like we did with the missionaries, it's worth reconsidering where Phelan was coming from, right? He was an American historian trained at Harvard and Berkeley, working in the 1950s and 60s, a time where scholars especially focus on the colonial institutions and how they functioned. And I think his lens reflects that moment. He's primarily interested in how Spanish rule was structured and extended.
Absolutely. Phelan's big contribution was framing the Spanish colonial experience in the Philippines comparatively, especially against Mexico. His central argument, based largely on administrative and religious sources, is that Hispanization in the Philippines was relatively indirect, one might say mild, compared to the Americas. He points to the smaller number of Spanish colonists, the lack of vast mineral wealth, and the initial Spanish focus to trade rather than large-scale land exploitation.
That's right. He also emphasizes how Filipinos responded, not just as victims, but as agents. He introduces the idea of folk Catalonism, where the local blended old religious practices with the new Christian teachings. This, to him, is an evidence of adaptation rather than submission. But Phelan's background shapes how he sees this adaptation. Coming from a tradition of institutional history, he tends to focus more on structures, governance, tribute systems, religious orders, than on the lived experience of those being governed.
That makes me think. Relating this back to our question about what caused the most profound rupture, Phelan here really emphasizes the socio-cultural and political transformations. In fact, he details the introduction of Spanish governments, like the Gobernadorcillo and Cabeza de Barangay system, the role of the church and missionaries as the primary agents of Hispanization in many areas, and of course, the imposition of the tribute and labor systems, or polo y servicios. For Phelan, the major rupture seems to be this institutional and rather religious restructuring.
But where does Phelan fit into the historical debate? I think probably his work, while groundbreaking, has definitely been debated. For example, in later historians, they drawing on the different sources or theoretical lenses, they really have challenged some of his conclusions. So, for example, his emphasis on a mild conquest and relatively minor demographic decline has been questioned. He concluded that conquest did not unleash a sharp decline of Filipino population, which contrasts strongly with the Americas.
Right, and that's where someone like Linda Newson comes in later, directly challenging that demographic assessment with her focus on disease. Also, Phelan's idea of Hispanization, while acknowledging Filipino adaptation, has been critiqued for potentially downplaying more active forms of resistance or the fundamental violence inherent in the colonial project. Some might argue his focus on adaptation and syncretism creates a historical silence, again, truyo, around trauma and disruption caused by conquest, even if it wasn't identical to Mexico.
Right. And I think his work also tends to view the pre-colonial Philippines as somewhat fragmented and lacking the high cultural institutions of the Americas, making it perhaps more receptive to Spanish influence in his view. William Henry Scott's later work, focusing on the internal complexity and the sophistication of barangay society, offers a significant counterpoint here.
So, Phelan sets the stage by highlighting the importance of Spanish aims, political and religious, and Filipino responses, which is adaptation and syncretism. He weighs the cultural and institutional changes heavily, but his interpretation on the intensity of the rupture, especially demographically, and the nature of Filipino agency provides a crucial starting point for the debate that later historians like Scott, Raphael, and Newson would engage with, often by focusing on different evidence or asking different questions.
So, Carl, we got Phelan focusing on the imposition of Spanish institutions and Filipino adaptation, and Scott restructuring the pre-colonial Barragan world. Where does Raphael take us to the story?
Good question. Raphael dives headfirst into the complexities of communication, or maybe miscommunication, in the colonial Philippines. He focused primarily on the Tagalog region, and his book, Contracting Colonialism, argues that the process of translating Christian concepts into Tagalog wasn't a smooth transfer of meaning, but a site fraught with ambiguity, negotiation, and what he calls mistranslation.
Right. I think Raphael's perspective is also shaped by his own intellectual and cultural position. He's a Filipino historian trained in post-colonial theory at Cornell, now based at the University of Washington. His work draws on anthropology and literacy studies as much as on traditional historical methods. That background allows him to zero in how colonialism gets negotiated in everyday acts of meaning-making.
That's interesting to know. In fact, Contracting Colonialism, that title itself is provocative. What does he mean by contracting?
Yeah, it works on multiple levels. On one hand, colonialism involves imposing contracts, political submissions, religious adherence, economic obligations like tribute. But Raphael emphasizes another sense, contracting as a reducing, circumscribing, or containing. He argues that Tagalogs, in the very act of engaging with Spanish language and Christian doctrines, found ways to contract or limit the totalizing claims of colonial power. Translation becomes a very way of engaging with, but also holding at the bay, the foreign presence.
How does this even relate to our question about the most profound ruptures? If Phelan emphasizes institutional change and Scott the disruption of pre-existing culture, Raphael seems to locate the rupture at the level of language and consciousness.
Exactly. I think for Raphael, the introduction of Catalan word, especially untranslatable religious terms like Dios, Renacentos, and the phonic romanized script, replacing indigenous Babine syllabary, fundamentally reconfigured how the Tagalogs could represent their world and their relationship to authority, both divine and colonial. Learning Catalan, even imperfectly, or encountering it with catalog prayers, create a linguistic hierarchy and a sense of distance from a originating powerful source, God and the King, whose full meaning always remains slightly out of the reach.
So, conversion isn't just adopting new beliefs, but adopting a new relationship to language itself? A relationship mediated by the Spanish?
Precisely. Raphael analyzes missionary texts, grammars, and dictionaries, and also the confession manuals, much like the primary sources we discussed earlier. But he reads them for their linguistic strategies and the anxieties they reveal about controlling meanings. He shows how concepts like sin, debt, and shame were translated and redeployed by the missionaries, but argues that Tagalogs often reinterpreted this within their own existing frameworks of reciprocity and social obligation, leading to unexpected and often unorthodox forms of belief and practice. And I do think this resonates with Phelan's folk catalysm, right? But dives more deeper into the linguistic and psychological mechanism at play.
Wait. So, how does Raphael's argument fit into thinking meta here? The AH-110 historical debate with the others. He clearly builds on, but also departs from Phelan. He's less focused on broad Hispanization and more on the micropolitics of linguistic exchange and its impact on subjectivity.
Right. Compared to Scott, I feel like Raphael is less concerned about restructuring the authentic pre-colonial. Right. And I think compared to Scott, Raphael is less concerned about restructuring the authentic pre-colonial past and more interested in how that past was actively reimagined and contested through the language of colonialism. His focus isn't just on what Tagalog society was, but what it became through the process of translation and conversion.
And compared to Newson, Raphael's work highlights cultural and linguistic factors as primary drivers of change, while Newson foregrounds the biological impact of disease and demography. They aren't necessarily contradictory, but they focus their analysis on different forces shaping the early colonial experience. Raphael shows how people's understanding of their world was ruptured, while Newson shows how their physical existence was ruptured.
Right. I think Raphael's approach, deeply influenced by post-structuralist and post-colonial theory, aligned with Conrad's post-colonial lens, offers a powerful way to understand Filipino agency, not just as overt resistance, but as operating subtly within the very language imposed by the colonizer. The limitation, perhaps, is its intense focus on Tagalog region and linguistic analysis. It also kind of potentially downplaying broader political economic structures or regional variants that Phelan or Newson might emphasize more.
So, Raphael contributes a crucial dimension to the debate by arguing that the translation inherent in conversion was itself a fundamental force, rupturing old ways of understanding and creating new, often ambivalent forms of Filipino identity and consciousness under Spanish rule.
As we wrap up our dive into the early Spanish Philippines, one thing is clear. The age of conquest here wasn't just a single event. It was a layered, decades-long process that reshaped the islands and their peoples in lasting ways.
Right. We began by asking what caused the most fundamental rupture: military force, religion, economics, or disease. And while conquest and epidemics created immediate upheaval, we argue that the deepest transformations came from the sustained pressures of Catholic conversion and the imposition of colonial economic and administrative structures.
These changes restructured worldviews, reorganized communities under rejection and principhalia, and introduces constant demands through tribute and forced labor. Even in the biased primary accounts of Plasencia and Chileno, we can trace how new identities and hierarchies were formed and how Filipinos negotiated or resisted those changes.
And this brought us to the heart of the historical debate. Phelan emphasizes Hispanization and adaptation, while Scott challenged us to recover the complexity of disrupted barangay societies.
Right. Ruffle then turned to translation, revealing how conversion became a space for both submission and subtle resistance. And Nielsen here centered the biological impact, linking population decline to disease and colonial exploitation.
Together, these perspectives remind us of a core insight from Session 11. No single framework is enough. Understanding rupture means weaving together imperial structures, regional differences, local communities, and individual consciousness. As Conrad suggests, it takes comparative, transnational, and post-colonial approaches to move beyond event-driven or Eurocentric narratives.
It also means confronting the challenge of historical silences, especially in colonial archives shaped by power. As Julia reminds us, recovering marginalized voices requires critical, often creative interpretation. Scott does this through ethnographic reading, Ruffle through the politics of language and mistranslation.
In the end, the conquest of the Philippines is more than a regional episode. It's a key case in the history of early globalization and empire. It shows how global ruptures affect societies differently, depending on local structures and the responses of those being colonized.
And its legacy endures in religion, language, and deeply rooted in social hierarchies. Engaging these historical debates helps us better understand not just the past, but the present.
Thanks for joining us as we explored the Spanish conquest of the Philippines.
And keep questioning the narratives. Till next time.